Welcome. Welcome everyone to the Political Theory Project's Odyssey lecture. It's really a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon and to be able to share this time and space with you all. My name is Emily Scarbeck. I am an associate research professor here at the Political Theory Project, where our mission is to investigate the ideas and institutions that make societies free, prosperous, and fair. So we approach these big questions from an interdisciplinary perspective, combining insights from history, from philosophy, from economics, and politics. And we at the PTP are committed to encouraging and providing venues like these for free thinking and dialogue at Brown. Our programming allows students to have regular opportunities to consider the ideas of leading scholars and public figures that are coming from different disciplinary backgrounds and holding different ideological viewpoints. For example, our Janus Lecture Series is a series that showcases two lecturers that are distinguished scholars that come from different disciplines and different backgrounds to address pressing problems from different perspectives. So, for example, in 2019, we hosted Nobel laureate in economics Paul Krugman and prominent cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker to engage with one another on the question of the progress of humanity, about where we are and where we're going. So following today's event, we'll be hosting an open house at our building. It's located at 25 George Street. If you're interested in getting to know a little bit more about what we do and who we are, please do stop by. We'll be hosting some light snacks and hors d'oeuvres and mingling outside so you can get to know and speak with our faculty, and our guest, Jonathan, will also be joining us. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce a conversation between Professor John Tomasi and our guest, Jonathan Rauch. Professor Tomasi is the founder and the director of the Political Theory Project. His widely acclaimed book, Free Market Fairness, combines a defense of economic liberty with a Rawlsian concern for social justice. Today, he's going to be talking and interviewing with award-winning columnist Jonathan Rauch. Jonathan is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. His work is really wide-ranging, covering American democracy, political parties, free speech, gay marriage, and religious liberty. He is author of 8 books and numerous articles on public policy, culture, and government. His writing has been recognized with numerous prestigious awards, including the National Magazine Award for Columns and Commentary and the National Headliner Award for Magazine Columns. Jonathan's newest book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, is the topic of today's conversation. The book diagnoses the many challenges Americans face in distinguishing facts from fiction. But the book does more than diagnose. Rauch calls on the reality-based community and Americans more broadly to reconstitute the institutions of society that enable true and accurate judgment to surface. Newsweek has called the book one of the timeliest books of the year, and it's already been selected as a New York Times Book Review editor's choice. So please join me in welcoming our guests for a conversation.
Hi, I'm John Tomasi. Thank you for coming. It was a beautiful day and you came to this instead, showing your genetic lines are true. Because you came, I want to do a favor to you. And the favor goes like this. 25 years ago, when I first came to Brown, a friend who I admire sent me this book by Jonathan Rauch, Decline of the Inquisitors. And he told me, if you're going to teach at Brown, you have to read this book. This book sat on my shelf for 25 years unread. Sorry. I did read it. I did read it this summer, shortly after I decided to be leaving Brown. But when I read it, it was so alive, and it made sense of so many things that I've seen in my time here. I just wanted to tell you, this is one of the most remarkably prescient books I know of. If I read it 25 years ago, I would have been much wiser during my years at Brown. And now my advice to you, buy it and read it. It's a truly remarkable book, as you will see.
Or at least buy it.
That was not my advice. Buying's easy, right? Any schmuck can buy. You got to read it. I want to begin by setting the historical stage. I'm going to go back before 25 years. And this is a stage, I think, on which Jonathan's ideas are playing out. So I'm going to just go back and set the stage briefly, and then we'll move into our conversation. So I'm going to begin with a stage setting in 1859. 1859, John Stuart Mill publishes On Liberty, his famous defense of freedom and individuality. In chapter 2 of that book, he gives a very important defense of free speech and the importance of an account of why viewpoint diversity is so important. And he makes 3 main arguments in favor of, on behalf of viewpoint diversity and freedom of speech. Mill says first, when you have a majority opinion and a minority opinion, it's important to recognize that the majority opinions have often been wrong. And if we silence dissenters or discourage dissenters, we may silence the truth. Argument 2. Mill says that among humans, the best way, indeed the only way, to get knowledge is through a free and open marketplace of ideas. Argument 3. Mill says that, interestingly, even false ideals are valuable. Even false ideas are valuable. Because when you encounter false ideas, it affects the way we hold the truths that are our beliefs that are actually true. We hold our truths in a lively way rather than as dead dogmas. So that's John Stuart Mill, famous arguments. Many of you, I'm sure, know those. 1965, Herbert Marcuse gives a talk at Brandeis, just up the road, called Repressive Tolerance, and writes a paper of that same name. And Marcuse begins by saying, John Stuart Mill was right. And by the way, when you hear a critic begin opening by saying, my opponent's absolutely right, I agree on everything he says, you know he's a heavy hitter. So Marcuse says, I agree with all that. It's true. Free and open discourse is the way to pursue truth. It's the way to get knowledge. But whether it's going to happen is an empirical question. It depends, Marcuse says, whether our marketplace ideas will bring us to the truth depends upon the background conditions. And if there's background conditions of power imbalances, then that will be reflected. The marketplace will simply reflect those imbalances. There are arguments like this in commodities. There's also arguments like this in the area of knowledge. And Marcuse, as some of you probably know, as a Marxist, says, well, free speech of the Millian sort and a free market liberal society is going to replicate the power dynamics of the capitalist class dominating the conversation, just as they dominate society, and are going to suppress the voices of the weak and the marginalized. Marcuse's argument has legs, right? You can sort of see it happening in different areas. You can see it on the Brown campus, for example, when we think, is there free and open speech? Well, what are the background power dynamics on this campus? What are the forces of majority and minority? Which are the dissenters? Which are the dominant voices? If Marcuse is right, that marketplaces of ideas lead to a reflection of what's already existing, there's a concern about, if you see and you also see an imbalance, there's a concern about what that might mean for how we can track truth as a community in those conditions. Now, moving to 2021, Jonathan Rauch. And Jonathan, I just want to begin by asking you, what do you make of Mill's idea about the marketplace of ideas being in the way we find truth?
It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. But before I go there, if you'll permit me a note of thanks.
I'll permit anything. To
you and the Political Theory Project, and all of you who are coming today. For those who are standing in the back and don't want to stand, there are lots of seats down in this lower half of the room. And also to say it's incredibly flattering to be invited to Brown. Something as a kid I always dreamed of was giving a talk like this on free speech at a place like Brown. So thank you for that.
Is that because your siblings went here?
Yeah, both of my siblings went here. I had to endure 2 graduations of siblings at Brown. And neither was the commencement address by John Stewart. So what Mill says is necessary but not sufficient, and that's the reason I wrote this new book. The old book is Kindly Inquisitors, 28 years old, prescient and all that. Unfortunately, I was hoping it would be out of date. But it posits the idea that there's such a thing as what I call liberal science, which is a way that free and fair and productive societies make knowledge. And it's like an economic marketplace or a political republic, and that you got a lot of criticism, and it depends on the exchange of criticism. So it's quite Millian. And then I went away and did other things. I spent years fighting for same-sex marriage and doing other things. And then we saw the emergence in 2014, 15, especially 16, of some big worrisome developments, which we'll talk about later. And I realized that I thought others in the field had missed a crucial element. And that was that the marketplace of ideas is necessary. I love that metaphor. I use it all the time. But it is not sufficient. Because if you just put people in an environment where all they're doing is having unstructured conversations, they quickly divide into groups and tribes. They become cultic. They display outrage in order to attract attention. They use tribal behaviors like insulting the other side, virtue signaling. They engage in confirmation bias instead of disconfirmation bias. In other words, they're looking for stuff that they already believe is true. They don't even have to do that consciously. They have trouble coming to agreement, so they then split into tribes and sects, and they go to war with each other, and that's the first 200,000 years of human history in a nutshell. So what happens is that you get Catholics and Protestants murdering each other across Europe for 150 years, killing maybe 30% of the population of Germany. And some liberals come along and say there's got to be a better way. But what people miss is they don't just say, let's have free speech, and the rest happens automatically, because it doesn't. Free speech by itself, you wind up with Twitter or Facebook, a race to the bottom. What they also said is you need a lot of structure. You need a lot of stuff that forces people to persuade each other in making knowledge, and forces them to come into biases and prejudices that are different from theirs. Do this in a structured way so that the conversations are impersonal and productive. Follow a lot of rules so that you don't do ad hominem attacks, you don't do harassment. It's all decentralized, depersonalized. This is what science, broadly defined, including the humanities, literary criticism, and whatever, looks like at Brown. It's what my field, journalism, looks like. Tons of rules and structures, second sourcing, run corrections, check for accuracy, all the stuff that you have to do. It's what government looks like when it's working. Congressional Budget Office, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, CIA, all of knowledge seeking. And it's what law looks like, which is lots of structure and apparatus to establish facts. It's what judges and juries do. It's why lawyers have to write fact-based briefs. So all of those things are structured around what I call the Constitution of Knowledge. It's very much like the US Constitution, because what it does is create incentives and structures that transform conflict into overtime consensus, and use conflict as a dynamic engine so that you can have a large, fair society. That's the Constitution of Knowledge. And I wrote the book because it seemed to be coming under consistent attack from the right and the left.
So you say conflict is a good thing. Conflicts can be productive. Can you say more about I want to zero in on something you said about what a human being is, what the nature of man is. So Aristotle tells us that man is the only rational creature. He more famously talks about man being a political being, kataphusin zoon politikon, a being who he says whose very nature is to exist to be political. But he says that we're political because we're rational. He sees rationality as the key feature of human beings. If humans are rational, aren't we just naturally good truth seekers?
Unfortunately not. Modern psychology suggests that David Hume was closer to being right than Aristotle. Hume says reason is and should be the slave of the passions. We think of ourselves, we think of the way the cognitive chain works as going from our eyes to our brain and then outward to society. Very often it's the other way around. What other people say and see and think deeply conditions what we think and even what we see.
The Solomon Asch experiment.
Famous Solomon Asch experiment. Yeah, look it up. If you put 8 people in a room and tell them they're getting a vision test, but 7 of them are actors and all give an obviously wrong answer, a third of the time, the 8th person will conform against the clear evidence of their own eyes, replicated many times. So we're trapped in these subjective shells where, yeah, we can be more or less rational. Steve Pinker has a new book about how to be more rational, and that's a good thing. But real rationality, real knowledge, arises from what's been called intersubjectivity. And that's people being forced to test their own biases and prejudices against the different biases and prejudices of others, very much like the US Constitution. Madison doesn't say you're going to have only one faction, the right faction. He says you're going to have many factions, and you're going to pit them against each other. Right. It's a radical, dynamic idea.
Good. So I'm thinking that you're Jonathan visited a class that I teach yesterday afternoon, and we were talking about his ideas for 2.5 hours with a lively group of Brown students. And I haven't stopped thinking about it since. But let me just try something on you that I'm just sort of playing with. In the Political Theory Project, for years, we've been talking about viewpoint diversity and the importance of viewpoint diversity. And usually the way I unpack the mechanism within that claim that viewpoint diversity matters is frankly in kind of million terms. I think to myself, well, truth against truth, truth against falsity, let's run that out that way, and that way we'll make some progress. That's kind of what I walk around believing, frankly. But now thinking about our conversation yesterday and thinking about your book, you changed that for me. I want to see if you like this change I'm going to suggest. It's not truth against truth or truth against falsity. That's the Mill view. What you're saying is it's going to be bias against bias. It's going to be your view that, one person's view that Trump stole the election, another person's view that Joe Biden stole the election, and they're going to come together and have some sort of, hopefully, tighter facts that they're going to look at in sort of biased ways. Do you think it's true that the importance of viewpoint diversity can be boiled down to the interaction of biased people?
Yeah, the epistemic importance. There's a moral importance too, which to me, may, as a homosexual American, may be even more important. So we can talk about that. But yeah, the foundation of the Constitution of Knowledge is like the foundation of the US Constitution, which is you don't know what the right answer is going in. You don't know what the best policy is going in. You do know you live in a world where every individual and every group or tribe believes that they have the right answer and is going to try to structure society to force everyone else to agree with them.
Right.
So the radical move that these liberal systems that both constitutions make is to say, you know what, it's not for the system to prejudge the bias. We're going to use that bias. We're going to put it to work. One thing we are never going to try to do is eliminate prejudice and bias.
Right.
A mission.
Catch that idea, right? That's not going to be that. Maybe we'll reduce, we might want to aim to reduce bias, but on this model, we're going to accept bias. It might be the fuel, in fact.
It's the fuel, it's the raw material. We'd all like it if, I guess, people were less dogmatic, at least some of the time, but it turns out that dogmatic bias is a foundational driver of science, Good. Even the hard sciences.
Good.
And you pit them against each other. You want people to have these very strong opinions because that's what's going to motivate them to put in the 20 years of hard work and research and persuasion that's going to be necessary to write that landmark paper. So you've got to use that energy.
We've been having conversations, Jonathan and I, about some contemporary political issues that we see in different ways. And I was struck, by the way, about an hour ago when we were both talking about our views of the elections. We had to move from our strongly felt beliefs about how the press has covered various events to try to find facts that we could agree upon. But we're fairly educated people, but we live in a world of conviction based only partly touching onto facts in various sorts. When called upon, we can bring those facts out, we hope. But even people who do this for a living, embarrassingly enough, in my case at least, find myself not nearly as good at it as I know that I should be. I think that's the case for a lot of us. You mentioned Madison. So Madison has this idea that different people with different interests can be brought together in the right set of institutions and produce a good and perhaps just society. Can you say how you see yourself as a Madisonian? And then maybe you mentioned at one place in the book, a Madisonian in the realm of knowledge. Can you just say something about the Madisonian aspects of your view?
Yeah, I'd love to. James Madison, I assume most of you have heard of him. There is, not everyone has. New England. Not everyone has. He is the only founder who does not have a memorial in Washington on the Mall, though it's been said of him, if you want to see Madison's memorial, look around. So Madison, I believe, was the single greatest political genius who ever lived, including Aristotle. We'll see what you have to say about that.
It's false.
And I think if there's a lasting contribution of this book, The Constitution of Knowledge, it's the invention of Madisonian epistemology. Understanding that the same dynamics that empower the US Constitution and all that flows from that also empower this knowledge-making system we have. So Madison's great insight is he is a dynamic thinker. That is very unusual. He thinks about systems and institutions in ways that they're going to change over time, and he understands you have to harness those forces creatively. So Hamilton says we should have a big, strong federal government that does a lot of stuff. Jefferson says we should have a small, weak federal government in a kind of agrarian society. Madison, who writes the Constitution, says you're both wrong. We're going to create a set of institutions that are going to put these into perpetual rolling conflict. And the only way to get an outcome, to make a law, is to force compromise. And at the end of the day, that's what the Constitution is fundamentally doing. It's forcing compromise among people, humans, who never want to compromise. Right. But it shuts off all the other routes. It says you can't use coercion, you can't take over the government, all those sorts of things. And Madison understands that using this conflict dynamically is the only way that you can create a stable regime that will last for centuries. Because if you try to stop or bottle up the conflict, it just explodes in unpredictable ways. So scientific revolution and all that follows, the legal revolution, the Enlightenment, essentially the same model. The only way you can make knowledge in this model is you're going to have to persuade others. And by others, we don't just mean people who already think the way you do, people who have misguided beliefs that Aristotle is greater than Madison. You're going to have to persuade people, any old person, any reasonable person who sees it, ultimately should be able to reach the same conclusion you are following your logic, your evidence. That means you need to write in such a way that any of millions of people around the world in politics can read your paper, critique it, find evidence and argument. Now you created the possibility of a global hive mind, literally hundreds of millions of minds all over the world plugging into the reality-based community, working in this vast sort of hive mind of searchers for other people's errors, which is really what they're doing. They're accountable for their own and other people's errors. I'm trying to figure out your mistakes and prove them. You're doing the same for me. And we're doing this at a global scale, and that's why there is the vaccination in my arm that's protecting me right now in record time.
Right. One thing you say is that a free stage or a marketplace of ideas is not enough. We also need a healthy information environment, what you call a constitution of knowledge. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that in the context of campus politics. There's a debate about whether free speech is a right or whether free speech is a bad thing, but people often use rights language when they talk about free speech. But in your book and in speaking with you, I often hear you attending to other things like free speech seems to be tied up with duties and obligations. Can you just say some more about that? Given your view of flawed humanity, where do the obligations lie if there are all these obligations, and what are they? What are the duties?
So there are three things that matter. Three things you got to get right if you want to have a well-functioning reality-based community. That is a community that's moored to actual reality and that is capable of settling its viewpoint differences in a civil and productive way. The first of them is freedom of speech. So that's a big one. We've all heard a lot about it. It's only one of three. The second is the discipline of fact. And that one is really hard. That means you need to try to be accurate. You need to hold yourself accountable for your inaccuracies, correct them if they're wrong, and do the same with others. And be in a community where that matters. So just saying my personal narrative, my subjective experience, my race, tribe, skin color, political belief, political party, this qualifies me to evade the scrutiny of others and to evade the rigorous processes of finding knowledge. You can't do that. That's malpractice. And this is really hard to stay anchored to these protocols of staying fact-based. And then there's a third thing that you need, and that's diversity of viewpoint, because the other two don't work without it. If everyone in the room or everyone on campus believes the same thing, or just as important, believes that everyone believes the same thing because you've got an artificially manipulated environment, I think we're coming to that.
Me too.
But if you have this environment of apparent or real monoculture, where everyone seems to believe the same thing, then you're not asking the fundamental challenging questions about the core premises that are going to enable you to find error. And you get involved in what I call zombie science. That's where you think you're engaging in criticism, conversation, correction, all the things that are going on, but you're just actually hearing yourself reflected back because everyone has the same starting point and everyone ultimately has the same ending point. And alas, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that we're seeing an unhealthy and potentially even dangerous amount of that in academia.
This is Marcuse again, right? You're sort of hearing this echo of what I was saying before about the power dynamics. Something you say in the book, one of the main themes in the book is that, now I'm bringing us now closer and closer to the present. I'm going to move us to 5 years ago. And then, by the way, very soon I'm going to move it to the actual this minute where I'm going to turn to you all to invite questions. So if you have things in your mind you're thinking about, please think about organizing them into a question, because I'll be giving you a chance soon to join the conversation. But now just going...
We do have plenty of seats, by the way, so come on down. I had a COVID test a few days ago.
So you say that in the past 5 years or so, you see that we've had a systematic and very effective attack on the knowledge-building community in the United States, both from the left and from the right. Can you say something about the nature of the attack that you've seen in the last 5 years? Like what's happened in the last 5 years regarding these structures that you talk about?
Well, a bunch of things. And it's hard to keep this one very brief, but I'll try. So, first of all, as you all know, there's the social media revolution. And that makes it very easy to manipulate the epistemic environment in ways that were hard to do in the past. If you want to run a cancel campaign now, you can do it at a touch of a button. You don't have to have a printing press and print flyers and organize people. And then you get stuff like Facebook, which it turns out accelerates outrage faster than it accelerates careful truth-telling. So you get that whole complex of things. Then you get groups of people that turn out to be very good at exploiting those things. One of them is in the realm of disinformation, broadly defined. So the world of information warfare is the world of people and nations and institutions that are trying to manipulate the information environment to deceive people, distract them, disorient them, deplatform them. Ultimately, the goal here is to demoralize them,
right?
To make them feel helpless so they can't tell what's true or false. They don't know what's up or down. Even if you tell them facts and show them that they're well-grounded, they'll still won't know what to believe because they're cynical and helpless. This is what the KGB is good at. This is what Vladimir Putin is good at. And I argue what I'm about to say will sound partisan to some of you. I'm sorry, I'm center-right. I have voted for many Republicans and supported them in my life. So hear me out on this. Donald Trump and the MAGA movement did something we have never seen or even imagined in America before, which is adopt and adapt Russian-style mass disinformation tactics to American politics. It is not a coincidence that Trump is clocked at lying approximately 20 times a day. This is what's known as the Russian fire hose of falsehood method, where you, as Steve Bannon, Trump's own strategist, said, you flood the zone with shit.
Right.
You pollute the epistemic environment with so much misinformation, disinformation, the media can't fact check it, no one can keep up with it, people throw up their hands. And it's only one of the things they're doing. There's also trolling, AKA attention hijacking. There's conspiracy bootstrapping, when they float these crazy theories and then build on that. And then there's this whole other wing, which is more relevant to campus. Sorry about the long answer, but it's the whole second half of my book in a nutshell. So this is what's come under the general rubric of canceling, a word that did not even exist when I started the book. And this is using social coercion to manipulate the information environment. So you don't have to be a government to do this. If, for example, I can persuade that John Tomasi that making some statement or other is dangerous to him and that he better not say it, he'll get in trouble, he'll suppress that in most cases. I don't know if this one will. Most people will suppress that. They'll say, I don't need the trouble. I'll say something else. If you can do that more broadly, you create what sociologists call spirals of silence. You no longer know what other people think, so they're not saying it.
Right.
So you can create a false consensus,
right,
where it seems like what a small numerical group of people believe on a campus, small groups of radical activists who are very outspoken. It seems like they're huge and important and speak for a lot of people because the others aren't speaking up. This not only plays with the environment by chilling it directly, it actually plays with our brains, because remember what we said earlier. What we believe and even what we perceive is mediated by what we think people around us believe. So, who's doing this? Anti-vaxxers, 2014, they figure out how to swamp the internet in such ways that if you Google vaccination, it looks like it's dangerous, and that's what lots and lots of people believe. It's a tiny fringe belief, but they greatly exaggerate their influence. So take another fairly closed environment, a university. You can have small numbers of activists who are able to manipulate the environment by weaponizing course evaluations, calling for investigations, doing deplatformings, tarnishing people's reputations, running campaigns against them, making it so if you speak out against them, the word racist will come up whenever you're searched by an employer. This not only silences them, it changes the atmosphere of the entire campus. So that now everyone is afraid in many contexts to speak. The last thing they do that is really clever, this is very sophisticated stuff we're talking about, folks. They don't want to let you know what it's safe to say and not say.
Right. Right.
So progressives get blown up all the time too.
Right.
And that's part of it. They want to create an environment where everyone is demoralized because no one knows where the safe harbors are.
Good.
So we become our own police. This is how the Soviet Union worked. You never knew what Stalin would come after you for, so you became the police, enforcing against yourself, far more broadly and deeply than the state could do. So Mill, our friend, 1859, says the biggest threat to freedom in Britain at that point is not from government censorship, it's from the social suppression of what he calls eccentricity, what we call individuality.
That's right.
And what I call viewpoint diversity.
That's right. And another thing I would say about the domination that you describe, it's not just that a group can come to present its view as dominant, it's also that it presents that view as being a kind of a closed system that seems to seems to possess truth in itself. And I'll just give an example that I've been thinking about over the last year or so. Think about structural racism, the idea of structural racism. And people see that as a kind of a breakthrough way of thinking about race in America, and I think it has some really important insights. And yet, very often, the idea of structural racism is presented in such a way as though it had all of the truth about our understanding our racial situation. And thus, other extremely important, potentially regenerative possibilities, concepts to do with, for example, personal agency, individual agency, or small group agency, get dropped out of the picture to become made invisible by that paradigm. If people aren't able to speak up about these things, if they're intimidated from speaking out about these things, we might find that paradigm just goes on as it is without getting tested. I'm not claiming that that's the right way to correct that paradigm, but every paradigm is going to have blind spots. And I love your Trump analysis. I think that's just fascinating. And the fire hose of manure, it's a really good analysis of that. I wonder if you could say something about universities. Do universities play some special role in this? You list these 4 different pillars of the knowledge building community. What role do you see for universities? And what might we do about universities as they are now?
Well, they're first among equals. And I think there's a lively debate in my world, the kind of center-right, anti-MAGA world about, and also anti-woke world, anti-extreme radical woke world, I should say.
You call yourself center-right. You keep doing that. I'm not tracking it. How are you center? Why are you not center-left?
Because
you like that designation in some.
I don't know what I am anymore.
But are you masquerading for tactical reasons? I know you're a strategist. Or do you think of yourself as
because I'm not fundamentally an egalitarian.
Oh.
And I think if you're a person of the left in America or anywhere, it has to be one of your goals to equalize things in society. And I don't care very much about that. I'm more in the direction of let people thrive. Inequality will result, but that'll be better than the alternative.
Okay, that's interesting.
And so I don't think that's consistent with where most of leftism is.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah. So universities, they're the long pole in the tent because they transmit, teach, practice the values of the Constitution of knowledge. They're the central keepers of these ideas. We argue in my circles about, so who's the greater threat? MAGA, Stop the Steal, who have convinced up to 70% of Republicans and a substantial share of independents that the 2020 election was stolen. Something that is fundamentally incompatible with liberal democracy. Which is worse, that or radical woke ideology, whatever you want to call it. And I think the answer right now is that MAGA is the worst threat because they have a whole party that they control and a whole media ecosystem that they control, and they might run the government in 4 years. That said, The problem with the side of this on the left is it's become deeply embedded increasingly in journalism, but especially in academia. And that is the place where corruption can be the most dangerous, because that is the place where you most rely on transmitting the kinds of values that we're talking about today. So if academia becomes a place where we're seeing indoctrination instead of instruction, or we're seeing, instead of criticism, being replaced with repetition, sometimes with propaganda,
Right.
or if we're not teaching these values to each other, to succeeding generations, then that's a deep and dangerous corruption. We not only lose some knowledge as a result of that, we also may lose the ability over time to protect the way we get knowledge.
Right.
So yeah, I'm worried about it. The other big aspect is I think a man named John Tomasi will soon be in a position to do something about this. The worrying decline of viewpoint diversity in many fields and disciplines of academia and in many universities, where it's now possible in a lot of fields, I think, to go through your entire career pretty much and never encounter someone who's a conservative or even a libertarian.
That's right.
And that's going to hurt the science.
That's right.
And it's going to hurt the reputation of the university, and it's going to hurt the whole enterprise.
That's right. John's referring to an organization I'm going to be leading in January called Heterodox Academy that is working on to improve viewpoint diversity and the quality of conversation on campuses around the world, but also especially in the United States.
Yeah, and it's, by the way, its constituency, according to its founder, is equal parts conservative, moderate, and progressive.
Right. That's right. I want to ask you a sort of a big question about free speech, and this is going to be my final question. Before I move to you all, then invite you to ask questions. I'm going to put it this way. We think about the importance of free speech, and you've given strong reasons for us to think free speech is an important value. And yet, sometimes I wonder, there's another set of values that seem to be rival to free speech, values to do with the search for a more just and inclusive world. And sometimes when people advocate free speech, they say that dissenting views are not merely wrong, that is, untruthful in the Millian sense, but they invoke some of the more recent ideas as well. They say that dissenting ideas, when you have a moral consensus in terms of progressive values, for example, like we have here at Brown, that those dissenting ideas, when they're spoken, are corrosive and are even dangerous to people. And I just wonder what you think about the general charge, which I'm hearing more and more frequently now, not just at Brown, I'm hearing at campuses across the country, that free speech is now often called a regressive or reactionary idea, in part for Marcusean reasons, I think, but there are other reasons too, now starting to grow within it. But what do you make of this idea that free speech is a regressive, reactionary, white supremacist view? Is free speech opposed to progressivism?
Well, what I make of it is it breaks my heart. So we've been on a high plane for most of this conversation, and I could answer this by saying all the things that you quoted John Mills saying at the beginning. You know, we need these contrary points of view to test our beliefs so they don't become dead dogmas. And you never know, the other side is going to say some things that are true. All of those million things, but I'm going to put it in a more personal way. I was born in 1960, and by the age of 5, I knew that I was different in a way that I could not change and that it was deeply socially disapproved of. It took me until the age of 25 to come out as gay because of the deep conflicts and discrimination that involved. In the 90s, it seemed to me that same-sex marriage was super important for the gay community for all kinds of reasons and would strengthen marriage. And I got ready to start writing about this, and my father said, in a conversation in September of 1995, he begged me not to take on this issue. And it wasn't that he had anything against me for being gay. It was that the idea of a man marrying a man or a woman marrying a woman was so crazy, so weird and wacko that I would lose my reputation as a serious journalist if I took it up. And he was not clearly wrong about that at the time. So, to embarrass someone I love, in this room right now is my husband of 11 years. Now, this is within a generation. this happen. To me, I get up every morning, no matter all the bad things that go on in life, and think about what a miracle it is that I am married to a man, and it's not even very controversial. How did this happen? 2 words: free speech. It's not just me. Frederick Douglass said if free speech pertained in the South, the shackles of slavery would fall away in 5 years. John Lewis, the great civil rights leader who died just a couple years ago, said without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. The gay rights movement, we had nothing. We didn't have votes, we didn't have money, a political party or support. All we had were our voices, and we only got those in 1958 because of a Supreme Court decision that none of you have ever heard of called 1 v. Olison, which stopped the government from censoring our publications as obscene, which is what they were doing. We couldn't publish stuff. It was our voices and only our voices and years of arguing and pushing back that won us where we are today. And that's not just true of us, it's true of all minorities. So here's something that's unique about liberal societies. You can take other kinds of societies, take the Roman Empire, the Soviet Union, China today, whatever. And you can run the tape forward or backwards. And in terms of the treatment of minorities, the expansion of rights, and the greater inclusiveness of justice, you'll never be able to tell which way the tape is running. Sometimes they're more repressive, sometimes they're less repressive, depending who's in charge and what's going on. With a liberal society, you can always tell which way the tape is running because it's always going to be run over the long term, away from slavery, away from male domination, away from the oppression of homosexual people and now transgender people, and I predict soon it's going to be animals. Why that directionality? Because only liberal societies allow for the kind of dissent and open conversation and robust exchange of views that ultimately is how minorities forge their way forward. Challenge the conventional wisdom, take it on, show them you're right. So that's why it breaks my heart to see gay and lesbian people and so many other people fall for this nutty idea that freedom of speech and thought and inquiry is our enemy. It is not only our friend, it is our truest friend.
Thank you. So I'd like to see why the political theory party brought him to Brown. It's a glimpse. I'd like to open up the conversation now to you. So we can talk about, on the high level abstraction we've been doing, we can talk trolls, we can talk Trump, we can talk anything you like. Hunter Biden, laptops, whatever, anything that's Brown, of course, is always a delicacy. Please come down to the microphones and join the conversation if you'd like. This is when the Brown students start creeping toward. And I know most of them. Oh dear. Ryan.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Rauch, for speaking with us today. It was
nice to see you again.
Yep. It was very interesting talk. I'd like to ask you about your Madisonian epistemology, in the sense that is compromise possible? The way you outlined it in your talk is in Madisonian terms that people with their biases would come together and compromise. But when you pit people with mutually exclusive ideas together, perhaps some people believe in God, some people don't. Some people believe in small government, some people believe in big government. Those seem like mutually exclusive terms. So are we just pushing an inevitable conflict down the road for later? Or what exactly do you mean by compromise, and what might be an example of that?
Yeah, that's terrific. So just to clarify, in political Madisonianism is a compromise forcing mechanism. In the epistemic Madisonian system, it's a persuasion forcing mechanism. They're different things, but they force the same thing, which is you're going to have to talk to and deal with others. So you are right. Some things are very hard to compromise in politics. I would give you abortion. And some things are very hard to persuade in the epistemic realm, probably abortion as well. The great strength of the Constitution of Knowledge is not that it can resolve every question, because nothing can do that. What it can do is organize every debate, even on something as difficult as abortion or on purely moral questions. Even many theologians in seminaries rely on the same principles of the Constitution of Knowledge to organize their debates and discussions about, for example, the nature of God, knowing that they'll never be able to resolve it because they're in a whole different realm. But this can organize any debate, and the importance of that is it keeps us peaceful and civil. It says you're going to have to try to persuade others in an organized way. And once you put people to work at that, then they're out of the troll business. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get people out of the troll business.
Thank you. I'm gonna just sort of move us along. We have a long, please.
Thank you very much. I just have one quick question. If you could both comment on the place of anonymity in free and open speech.
Nice.
You first.
So the organization that I'm going to be leading in January, Heterodox Academy, has been going through a discussion about this over the past week. We have about 5,000 faculty members who signed up because they believe in our principles. Most of them are isolated, or there are individuals on campuses. They don't even know about other people on their campus who are members because we don't publicize their names. We have to decide, are we going to list the names of our members on the website and require that they be known publicly or be available publicly? I made a decision last week that we're going to start publicizing their names because that's what it means to be a member. So anonymity, it's got a place, but there's a cost to anonymity. And there's something about an opportunity that I think I want to make available to people to not be anonymous, but rather to stand up and to be heard, even though that means things will be difficult, perhaps. Do you want to say
I'll just add briefly.
Something happier?
All of that is right, and it's hard to generalize because you want different rules in different environments. For instance, whistleblower laws, you want someone to know the name, the identity of that, but you don't want the public to know that. Journalists deal with anonymous sources, things that we know who they are, but we don't tell the public. That said, if you want to be effective and persuasive in life, you're going to have to not be anonymous. You need to put your intellectual and moral capital on the line. And in the reality-based community, anonymity is used in, for example, peer review, but it's strictly cabined because it's very important to hold people accountable to following the rules, to setting and obeying reasonable standards. So generally, anonymity is not a big part of those systems, but it always plays some role, and you can't say it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Thank you. Please.
Hi. Thank you for coming again. You talked about two constitutions, the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution of Knowledge. When you made that comparison, the first thing that came to my mind was the U.S. Constitution is legally binding and the Constitution of Knowledge is not. Do you have a plan or an idea of how people should apply or if they should even enforce the Constitution of Knowledge? How do you make sure people stick to that to be productive?
Great question.
Yeah, great question.
I want to hear the answer.
So it is a great question, and I'm going to push back against the premise. The important part of the U.S. Constitution is not what's on paper. In fact, the founders all warned us. I can never get this quote right, but Adams said, in effect, that gallantry, and what was the other term he used?
Are you going for the Hobbesian line about covenants without the sword, about empty words?
Well, I was going for Madison saying that without basically people understanding and following the principles of the Constitution, gallantry and something else, meaning bad behavior, will pass through it as a whale passes through a net. Madison warned that the Constitution was just a parchment barrier. The real Constitution is norms like lawfulness, following court orders. The government can't make us do that if a whole lot of us decide not to. Obeying the law. When an election is over, the loser concedes. So judicial review, not in the Constitution. It's a norm that we developed. So Constitution of Knowledge is the same. It's not written down. Most of the US Constitution is actually not written down. But it is inscribed in the practices and norms of institutions like Brown, and students like you, and journalists like me, and professors like Professor Tomasi, who have been ingrained over years and years with these principles.
Right.
And they've acquired a moral valence for us.
That's right.
We believe it's wrong to plagiarize, for example. It is wrong to put false stuff in the newspaper. That's the Constitution of Knowledge. Yes, it's very vulnerable for just that reason. There's no one out there who can just enforce it. We have to enforce it. You and me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
This
you.
side, please.
Hey there.
Hello.
Oh, we going this way?
Yes.
Thanks. Is a healthy epistemological system environment over the course of human history, is that an aberration or the norm? And are we uniquely cursed right now in being in the one we're in? And then related to that, what would you do about Facebook? And then if you want, we can break them up, or what would you do? And if you'd like, given what you said about the majority opinion, what would you do about the filibuster?
So why don't you take one? Pick one of those.
There.
If you don't mind, to be able to pick one.
Sure. What was the first one? That was the one I
I
liked.
got Facebook and I got filibuster.
Healthy epistemological environment,
Is that the norm?
constitution of...
No, a healthy epistemic environment is not the norm. It's a very, very rare thing. The first 200,000 years of history, we basically solved our disputes by imprisoning, ostracizing, and killing each other, which is a very, very bad way to find knowledge. Liberal systems are very recent inventions. What, 300 years old?
Yeah.
350?
And if I can just add on that point, the Aristotle point that we were joking about before, it's actually highly relevant here. There was an idea in human history that starts with Aristotle, but it's best expressed by Aristotle, that if you're going to have a good society, you need to have consensus. You need to build a consensus to have a good society. The liberal idea was that maybe you can have divergence of opinion with the right institutions and have a better society. That you have a view of the good life and I have the view of the good life, and there are different views of the good life. Rather than having to argue it out and figure out who's right and who's wrong, we can find the right institutions that can allow you to power your life, pursue the things you care about, that redounds to my benefit and improves my ability to pursue my different view of the good life. That's the magic of the liberal society. That's the magic of the liberal order. We see it in economics, but it's also what happens in knowledge. I want to just keep going through the line because there's so many people. Can we do two?
I can never remember two, so I
Let's
could
do
try
one.
to do one briefly.
Please.
But
All right, sure. So it seems like we've learned a lot about the war on truth now. You've told us that there are powerful actors with active incentives to reduce truth on platforms like social media. You've also told us that there are even unconscious biases and things like the idea of a monoculture on campus and otherwise that also cloud our ability to effectively find truth. However, you've also pointed us to a theoretical framework for some world we should be pointing to, with things like freedom of speech as one aspect that also needs this idea you talk about discipline of truth. So my question is, given these powerful hurdles that you talk about, how do we win? How do we foster and cultivate that discipline of truth in our communities? And what are the actionable steps in general and on places like our university campus that we can use to foster these norm-setting principles you talk about?
Isn't it clear to us that one thing we can do is have meetings like this and have these kind of conversations? Because once you start to see the structure, once you start to see how our society works and how it can go wrong, then you have the beginnings to think about secondary, tertiary steps. But that's what I think the service you're providing for me and many others is like, here's an analysis of what we're doing, what's gone wrong. It's not just Trump saying things, which people react in all kinds of ways, but now we have a structural way of thinking about those things. Do you want to say more to that?
yeah, it's a huge question. I can't do justice to it in the time available. The book is full of actual actionable things, not just things that can be done, but things that are being done. I'm a fan of Facebook's oversight board. I'm a fan of Braver Angels, a depolarizing campaign. The more we depolarize, the less vulnerable we are to propaganda. The work of Heterodox Academy is very important. We're seeing counter-organizing against the manipulators and the cancelers, all kinds of things. But what I want to leave you with, I don't think we've ever met you before, and I don't know your name, but I'm going to address this to you, and you, and you, and you, and you, is the constitution of knowledge is not self-maintaining. A big problem with the marketplace of ideas analogy is it says, okay, you set up this marketplace and you let it go and it fends for itself and we all die happy. That is not true. It's much more like the US Constitution. We need to understand its principles and defend them.
That's right.
And because its principles are so counterintuitive, like not only allow but protect bigoted, racist, intolerant, wrong-headed speech, that's crazy. We have to get up every morning and figure out how do we defend this. Most of us in this room, not all of us, but probably most of us, are involved in some way with the reality-based community. One of the professions that's truth-seeking, if you're a doctor, a lawyer, librarian, teacher, work at a museum, scientist, many, many things, or if you're a student, you are part of this community. And there is something that you can do in your institution and your life to stand for these values. It might be if you see a friend being canceled, even if you think that friend is completely wrong, speak out against it, take their side and say this is wrong. It might be not retweeting that stupid conspiracy theory that you think is funny, but don't realize is then going to be retweeted by 10 or 100 more people, and someone won't get their vaccination. It may be that you stand up for viewpoint diversity on your campus. You ask your professor, so I'd like to hear from more conservatives. How can we make that happen? It might be to just not participate in the canceling campaign. There's all kinds of ways that we as individuals can embody and stand for these values. And here's the good news. Remember that experiment we talked about earlier? Solomon Asch experiment? You put 8 people in the room, 7 give a wrong answer, 30% of the time, the 8th person conforms, and 75% of trials, the 8th person conforms at least once. They did multiple trials. So change the experimental parameters just a little bit, just tweak them. 6 people are actors and give the wrong answer. 1 person is an actor and gives the right answer. In that room, the experimental subject's propensity to give the wrong answer drops from 5 to 10%. That's right. Because you've given them one so-called reality ally in that room, one other person who says you're not crazy, you're not malicious, you're not a danger to society if you say what you believe. So you can be a reality ally. And it will make a difference. It does not take 5,000 or 500 people to change the culture on a campus. It takes 50. Sometimes it takes 5.
That's right. That's right. There's opportunities, right?
Thank you. That was a great answer.
Wouldn't you want to live a life where there's challenges in front of you, where you can do wonderful things? So that's where we live. Please.
Thank you. In your opinion, how does the U.S. come back from the political polarization we're seeing, the disagreement on truth? How can we make that happen, if at all?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, if at all is the problem, right? We've never been this polarized since the Civil War period, the antebellum period, and as you know, that did not end well. Governability is getting harder because of intense polarization, and the forces I'm talking about are deliberately stoking that. That's why Vladimir Putin used his troll machine to stimulate opposing demonstrations on opposite sides of the street to divide us. It's why Donald Trump tweeted out, "Liberate Michigan," politicizing mask wearing and social distancing. And it's surprisingly easy to do if you want to polarize and divide a society. First thing we have to do is understand we're being manipulated. The second thing is we do have something important going for us. By us, I mean people like me, people who believe depolarizing is important, crucial even, which is Americans, all humans, hate to live in a toxic information environment. It's like living in some horrible sulfurous fog because you don't know what's true and what's false. You don't know what you can say and not say. You don't know what you can believe. You're hearing all this false stuff. It's sinister and corrupt. So there's a lot of people out there who want to do better, who hate the polarization. I know that because I'm involved with Braver Angels. We're now in all 50 states, braverangels.org. It's taking off as a national grassroots depolarization movement that's doing workshops and debates online and off. We're now on college campuses around the country and scaling that up with what we call Braver Angels debates. But this is people in their communities saying, you know what? We are sick of this polarization model. We are going to build an alternative model. And they're succeeding. In our workshops, the most common comment that people make in the evaluation is, we are less divided than we've been led to believe. And by the way, the evidence shows exactly that. One way to depolarize people is just to show them the fact that the other side is much less far from them ideologically than they believe. Just telling them that makes them hate the other side less. So yeah, it is a very long road. Depolarization and depropagandization are two sides of the same coin. The more polarized the society is, the more open it is to propaganda that hates on the other side. The more it's propagandized, the more polarized it becomes. Can you reverse that spiral? I hope your generation can. I'm encouraged by the fact that people are aware of the problem and taking civic action and other forms of action against it. But it comes down to what I said to this gentleman earlier. What can you do in your community?
Thank you. We'll do a couple more questions, then Salt, please.
Great. Hi, thank you for both. I'm a proud parent of a Brown student, and
You should be proud.
yes, and I come from what I used, from the left, or what I used to consider the left, and generally have a Marcusean view of speech and power. And most of the criticisms around the anti-woke movement that you called it come mostly from the right and are seen as sort of attacks against the critique of white supremacy, patriarchy, etc. But from the left, it feels like there is also a way that it actually reduces power, in that it increasingly, as I see, like it gets further away from a base of support and doesn't actually encourage organizing. So I wanted to see from the left and right, like where are base people who are implicated in that, what's playing out.
This is not my specialty, but for example, there's a whole book about how increasingly, it's written by progressive Mark Lilla, how increasingly the American left has substituted kind of personal activism, cultural activism for doing the hard work of organizing in politics, getting involved in the parties, getting the people elected, getting the votes to defeat the right, and that's been a tragic mistake. We're all busy talking about whether to capitalize black and not actually ending the war on drugs. I think that's a very powerful critique. So I think that's right. I also think, as Professor Tomasi does, we have a lot to learn from the left.
Yeah.
Our allies in the gay rights movement were overwhelmingly on the left, not on the right. Where I draw the line is where people start manipulating the environment so that only one part of the left gets heard. Increasingly, the left is one group of the left dominating everyone else on the left. So that's why it's important to create an environment where ideas like critical race theory, which we have a lot to learn from,
That's right.
can be introduced into an environment where they are critically examined in a robust, uninhibited way.
That's right.
Yeah, well, and then my follow-up to that
Can
is,
we, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
There's 3 people behind you.
Sure. That's a great question. Please.
You talked about polarization, the source of polarization is Putin and external country actors, state actors, right? But I think one source of polarization is our gerrymandering in the congressional districts, right? So I think I read that the number of swing state districts in this country has almost come down by 50 to 60%. So more and more districts are becoming heavily blue and heavily red. And obviously the people who win these elections in these districts, they don't want to come to moderate because they are fearful of being primaried, right? So what do you do? Because I completely agree with you. Persuasion and moderation is the tool to legislate and govern effectively. But what do you do to improve the moderates in this country when the districts are getting so extremely left and blue?
Got it. So if you go to the Brown Political Science Department, they will tell you that the evidence is that gerrymandering is actually not a big feature of polarization. And there are all kinds of ways we can talk about that, but that doesn't seem to be where the problem is. The second thing that you mentioned is a much bigger problem, and that's that the primary process has been captured by small groups of extreme activists, and especially in the Republican Party, the candidates that those activists want to reward tend to be, as one politician said, this is not me, this is Thomas Massey, a Republican, said they're going for, quote, the craziest motherfucker in the room. So the primary system, we are the only country that has that. Other countries let party professionals pick their candidates, and that's what we did until approximately 2016. And so I think the big place to start looking, well, there are 2 places. One is to return more professional vetting to the candidate selection process to screen out the sociopaths and others. The second is, if I could do one thing to reduce polarization in this country, it would be to get Congress working again. It is the one and only institution in our country.
Congress what?
It would be to get the United States Congress working again. It is the one and only forum in this country, both constitutionally and socially, which is there to do the difficult job of brokering many factions and figuring out ways to move forward together. And when it's not working, as it pretty much isn't now, no one else in society can pick up that job, and that makes us all a lot more polarized. So fixing Congress, crucial.
Thank you. When we're starting to talk about fixing Congress, we're moving to the bigger pictures now. I wanted to say, if people need to leave, you should do so right now. We're going to stay for maybe 10 more minutes and take these 3 questions and this one. So we have 4 more questions. If you want, please.
Okay.
Hi, Professor. I'm a student. My name is Tian Yu, and I just joined the PP Society at Brown. I want to ask you about how do you think about the extent to which the constitution of knowledge can be applied, and the extent to which the reality-based community can be built? Because in my mind, democratization does not lead to definitely good decision-making in many cases. Because enlarged political participation does not necessarily increase the input of thoughtful judgments. In many cases in our lives, as recently there's a building up literature on political participation and how people who choose their presidents and local election candidates are not able to gather enough information about them and make the right choices. So the book by, as you definitely are aware of, Christopher Asian, he wrote a book called Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Cannot Produce the Socially Optimal Outcomes. So how would you respond to the question that if you argue for a more truth-based and fact-checking community of knowledge, how does that not contradict the thesis of democratization? And will democratization lead to harm in that community?
So it does contradict the thesis of democratization. The U.S. Constitution is not a pure democracy, as you know. It is heavily professionalized. In fact, the original Constitution, there's only one branch, which is even accountable through elections. Madison's system is a hybrid of professional politicians working in concert with democratic input. Constitution of knowledge is the same thing. Anyone can contribute evidence and arguments, but what's in the textbook is largely defined by what's going on in campuses like this, and done by specialists and professionals, often whose language you can't even understand. So it is not a democratic process. It is a heavily structured professional network. And it doesn't govern the entirety of our lives, because that's all it is. But it does give us objective knowledge.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the second question over here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have a question. So you talked about sort of like a mechanism for generating epistemic truth being compromise and sort of like a consensus building from that. But
Persuasion.
Okay. There are also sort of our institutions for generating compromise and persuasion are also sort of inherently biased one way or another. Take, the filibuster as an example. Is there sort of a way to parse the idea that maybe, a filibuster might support one side of a particular issue over another while still generating consensus? There's a structural bias, but how do you get a consensus out of that?
So I actually don't think there's a structural bias in liberal science if there's enough diversity of viewpoint to ensure that biases are countered by other biases. That's why viewpoint diversity is so important. Now, there will be the biases of the people involved, and if everyone involved is a white male heterosexual, then you're going to have nonsense like defining homosexuality as a mental illness. That's the world I grew up in. But that was countered within the community of science by other scientists, some of whom were gay, like Frank Kameny, who challenged it. So over time, and it doesn't even take that much time, if there's enough viewpoint diversity and structured conversations that forces people to be accountable for their errors, that's the best error correction mechanism that we've got.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Over here and then here, please.
Thank you so much. I, too, am a champion of free speech, believe in it 100%, but I'm also an egalitarian. So I was really interested in your perspective that you didn't consider yourself fundamentally an egalitarian, yet you're a champion of gay marriage. So can you just talk a little bit about that tension that strikes me as a little different?
Nice.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm an equal rights egalitarian. In that sense, classical liberal goes back to John Locke. But by kind of egalitarian I meant on the left, it's equal outcomes egalitarian. Like Aaron Wildavsky, the late great political scientist, once defined an egalitarian as someone who whenever they see a difference between things, they want to minimize it. So humans and animals, humans and the planet, and so forth. And I'm not that kind of egalitarian. But yeah, equal rights for sure. That's the core of a liberal idea, right? Equality before the law, equality in making knowledge, following the rules. If you follow the rules, you get the prerogatives. So that's how I square it.
And I'll just
Thank
add
you.
one little twist on that. That if you think about the left ideology, how to characterize it, there's sort of two main theories of justice, two approaches to justice. One is egalitarian, equal outcomes, but the other one is prioritarian. It emphasizes how are the least well-off doing. On that second view, you can have an unequal society where the least well-off are doing better and better, and that might be an admirable society in some ways. It could be the just society. So there's an egalitarian view, which says justice is something like equality of outcome, let's say. And there's a fairness-based view, which focuses on the least well-off, even if there are some inequalities.
Thank you.
So two people, and this line became two rather than one. But you know, I like entrepreneurship, so so these are the last two questions. Do not creep over, please.
This question comes from Gordon Wood, who was fortunate enough to be a history major.
My dear friend.
Well, he wrote a book about Adams and Jefferson about 5 years ago, in which he showed, in my opinion, that Trump is the most like Adams of any president. Because Wood does real research. Adams wanted the president to be hereditary, permanent. Adams was an Anglophile, unlike Jefferson. He wanted the Senate to be like a parliament. He made fun of the word democracy, okay? Hamilton hated him, even though we were both Federalists. My point is that after Adams left office, he had nobody who liked him, really, in a wide space.
Just because we're getting so short on time, could you frame a question?
So the question is, why is Trump's following going to be different than Adams' following, and they both went nowhere? So I think people are overstating the danger of Trump, and based on what's it now.
I'm going to say that's a different conversation, and I and others have written a lot. I think Trump is sui generis. Closest thing I can think of in some ways is Andrew Johnson, who behaved in some of the same ways, but even he, I think, was more lawful and less sociopathic in his tactics. George Wallace has some similarities. Certainly the constituency of the MAGA movement is very similar demographically and ideologically to the constituency of the George Wallace movement. But I don't really see the parallel to Adams personally.
But I'll add to that if I may, that I was planning to teach a course this spring called Trump. So I thought Brown students have a chance to study Trump, and my thought was, I'm not teaching the class, my thought was to have historical figures who we could think, is Trump like them? And two that I picked three actually, going backwards in history. Barnum and Bailey, Andrew Jackson, and Napoleon.
You can add,
There's actually,
those are good. You can add Henry Ford. That's a conversation we can have. Henry Ford, in the 1920s, there was a huge movement to draft him for president, and he wanted to run, and he said, I can fix it. I'm a businessman.
that was Ross Perot.
There are also, for what it's worth, there are a lot of foreign analogies that are really quite close.
Yeah, well,
Victor Orban comes to mind.
Orban's good.
One more sentence.
I'm sorry, we got to go.
Thank you. Thanks for the historical question.
Last question.
Last one.
Very practical. I'm a physician working in the emergency room, pediatric emergency room. So, I'm going back to first things he said. David Hume, reason is a slave of passion. Passion and fear when you discuss things with patients or their parents. And holding people accountable with that combination of psychological difficulties. How can we practically move on to improve the discussion in this society? Not being afraid. How can we do that? Isn't that, and you mentioned, I think, the psychological difficulty is huge. That's what I'm seeing, like practical.
So you'll like the book. The last chapter is titled Unmute Yourself. And it argues that you can break the spirals of silence which are impelled by fear. when actually only a comparatively small number of people start organizing, pushing back, protecting each other, and protecting the principles that we're talking about today. And that can work surprisingly quickly. And I know that because I went from my father telling me don't even think about advocating gay marriage in 1995 to being married in 2010, nationally recognized in 2015. So you're absolutely correct. Fight the fear, organize, push back, and you will be surprised how strong we all are.
Don't clap yet, don't clap for 'em yet. I just want to mention again that there's an open house at the Political Theory Project happening now.
At 25 George Street.
At 25 George Street. You're welcome to attend. Do you want to say, should we clap for 'em or should I say it?
Let's go ahead.
Please join me.